Hello, hello, listener. So Noel Ignatiev is dead. You've probably seen some of his quotes lying around if you're in nationalist circles a bit, because he was a very, very committed anti-white activist. And he unfortunately lived a fairly long life. He died at the age of 78. So, what was Noel Ignatiev? Well, he was a Harvard professor of history. He was a pioneer in anti-white works. He was one of the first, well, he was of course a Marxist, and he was one of the first to start publishing about whiteness as a concept, independent from race and so on. He's best known for a book called How the Irish Became White, which argues for, it propositions this idea of whiteness as a social class at the top of society. It's very American, of course. And the Irish sort of became white because they weren't considered white in the past or anything, which is all not really true if you actually look at the history. Yes, the Irish were looked down upon, but that had more to do with their low social class, their Catholicism, and a perceived drunkenness and misbehavior. Also, Catholicism was in the Protestant USA always an issue. They were also against the Italians over Catholicism, but they were never really not considered white. Irish were always considered white, otherwise we wouldn't have been allowed in the country, because the immigration laws at the time always said free men or white men of good character was the immigration law, so they couldn't have entered if they weren't considered white. They were, of course, treated as a second class, but that had to do with these other characteristics. So his whole premise is, of course, wrong. But I mean, it's an interesting thing about how all these different ethnic groups come in over time and they become what is now an American identity. But you should read E. Michael Jones's work on that, specifically the Slaughter of Cities book that treats a lot with that. That's not really Ignatiev's work. He of course treats race as if it's merely a skin color, a social construct. He's one of the pioneers of the idea of race as a social construct. So that launched him to fame, that got him his chair at Harvard, that book. It's a complete farce of an argument. But he's better known, actually, in nationalist circles for a publication he made called Traitor Magazine, which had the byline, "Treason to Whiteness is Loyalty to Humanity." And I'll give you some of the titles of some of the articles. So, Blackface, Jackstraws and Tin Paneling. Memoir as Confession by David John Zaido. Students for the Abolition of Whiteness, Chicago. Franklin Rosemont. Surrealism, Revolution Against Whiteness. The Surrealist Group of Madrid, Beyond Anti-Racism. Paul Garon, Psychiatry's White Problem, Racism as Therapy. Daniel C. Boyer, Are You Crazy? Mental Illness and Whiteness. Renew the Legacy of John Brown. Pat Henson, Plowshares into Swords, John Brown and the Poet of Rage. John Brown's very popular, and I've seen articles about John Brown, praising John Brown, and title issue about John Brown in at least 4 of the issues, of these 16 issues of Traitor Magazine. Now, John Brown was a American Christian who he tried to incite a rebellion in, I think it was 1850 or so, in the southern states of the United States against slavery. He tried to arm blacks and cause a violent revolution. To that end, he tried to occupy a weapons depot, but he was surrounded with his followers, fought till most of them died, and then he was hanged. Or I'm not sure, he might have died during the fighting. At any rate, this is, of course, apologia for violent racial insurrection against whites, which at the time of racial slavery, maybe you could make an argument for that, but in the current context, arguing for that is just, basically arguing for a race war from a leftist perspective. Following on actually that, David Barber, A Fucking White Revolutionary Mass Movement and Other Fables of Whiteness, which is an interesting one. I noticed in the titles as well that they have quite a lot of topics discussed from a leftist perspective that we discuss on the right today. For example, this one. Lauren Goldner, Review of Kevin Coogan, Dreamer of the Day. Francis Parker Yogi and the Post-War Fascist International. These people were talking, because this Traitor Magazine ran from 1993 to 2001, I believe. So these people were talking about things that are constantly being discussed on the internet in nationalist circles now, which is very interesting, like authors that are being republished by Arctos and so on, like Yoki, like Evola, and so on. They were already discussing this. The interesting thing is that the nationalist movement of their time was not intellectual at all. This is the famous 1.0 movement. These people were mostly acting against what was at the time a resurgent skinhead movement, which was particularly big in Europe, but also had quite a bit of growth in the United States. That period came to an end in the United States with Timothy McVeigh, Timothy McVeigh was not a white nationalist, and he was not really a racialist. He was mostly an anti-federalist, and he reacted to overreaches by the federal government in Waco and Ruby Ridge and so on. He was trying to punish the government for being tyrannical. So it's not really related to whiteness, but anyway, Timothy McVeigh kind of, he was accused of being a white nationalist, and that destroyed the whole skinhead wave of the 90s. This was the time of like the David Duke and William Luther Pierce and so on. This was their like when they were the prominent leaders of the movement, and most of the following was, skinheads and that sort of thing. There were a lot of political parties emerging in Europe at the time, like Vlaams Belang, CP86, the National Front already existed, but that morphed into the BNP. You had several existing parties go towards a skinhead phase, like the Austrian FPÖ, you had in Italy and so on. Anyway, the American History X, for example, that film, that's about that period. But, so the leftists were discussing the intellectual side of the far right more than the far right themselves at the time were reading it or talking about it really, or publishing or anything. It was a very, very different sort of movement then. At any rate, Noel Ignatiev, treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity. Thanks very much. He always, fled into this whole thing. He was always attacking whites, our history, our everything in the world is wrong because of whites. He literally said that. The only way to solve all the problems in the world is to destroy the white race. And he would always, play this Moat and Bailey, go back and forth with like, no, it's just a social construct. Whiteness isn't a racial thing. Your skin color and your ethnic group, that's not what defines you as white. It's your class and structural privilege and so on. Then at the same time, he would attack working class whites who are not part of a power structure at all, really. So on, and even in countries like South Africa, where whites, although in his time it was just post-apartheid, so you wouldn't have the very oppressed whites that you have now then, but still, in countries where whites are a minority and not in power, even there, the problem was whiteness as well, So good thing he's dead. Shame that he actually had so much influence on the intellectual legacy of the modern left. He was really a pioneer of this whole anti-whiteness thing. Interestingly, he doesn't talk very much about gender. He doesn't talk about transgenderism. He does talk a little bit about homosexuality and so on, but not very much. His thing is really, really, really focused on race and dismantling whiteness and patriarchy. Well, not even patriarchy. He just considers patriarchy as kind of implicit in whiteness. See, patriarchy is, of course, a white concept. No one else does that, despite the fact that religious, theocratic, and patriarchal societies are the norm throughout all of modern, pretty much all of history, pretty much all societies, regardless of race. And the only examples of matriarchal societies we have kind of been stuck in the Stone Age and never progressed. Like in Guinea, there's one in New Guinea, sorry, not Guinea. And you've got a few tribes in eastern China and in India, and they never progressed beyond the Stone Age because there simply doesn't seem to be an incentive within a matriarchal society for developing and progress. So press S to spit on his grave. Good thing he's dead. Shame about all the influence he's had on the modern left, on the world in general, and let's hope we can reverse his influence with our
Father, thine is the kingdom, the power and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. spirit to sanctify.